Victor Kgomoeswana is with the University of Limpopo. He joins us now tonight. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. Of course, in really understanding the nature of the violence that has, really engulfed the Tigray region of Ethiopia, we have to take the historical context as to what really led to the state of affairs being what it is, and in particular, the role of an organization, a liberation movement like the TPLF, and how its own position in Ethiopia has enabled the situation to be what it is.
Right. Good evening, Kathy. I'm so excited that there is an agreement at last. But I've got to say, the history is very simple. During the lockdown, the government of Ethiopia postponed elections or suspended elections because they felt in the lockdown it wasn't going to be the right time to campaign. Somehow, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, decided to continue with the regional elections. And in so doing, they defied the government. So picture in South Africa, if the national government says we have a lockdown, we are not having elections, and the provincial government of one province decides to carry on with elections. That's what triggered the conflict, because what they were doing, they literally said, we don't recognize Addis Ababa, we don't recognize the government of Ethiopia. And the problem was because TPLF since 1991 had been, if you like, the dominant, if I can say, ethnic group, because the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front was not a party, Kathy, it was a coalition. So it used to recognize the ethnic identity of the different, if I can say, tribes of Ethiopia. So, but the TPLF had been the dominant one because that's the one that Meles Zenawi, the late prime minister, belonged to. So you can almost say, with no disrespect intended to TPLF, they had been used to ruling or running Ethiopia since 1991. That when somebody from Oromia in Abiy Ahmed came in and took over, and then he said, I'm changing the coalition into a party, prosperity party, they felt that they were being pushed to the back burner. And that's how they started believing that they were entitled to act the way they did. But I'm glad that eventually sanity has prevailed, because Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has done so much to stabilize that Horn of Africa region. This was such a downside of a very good progress that he had made since he took over just a few years ago.
And that nuance that you're speaking about, Victor, around what led to the tension and also the ethnic element of it has really been pronounced over the last 2 years during this conflict.
Yes, and it's like in South Africa. Again, I'll use the South African example because that's what many people can relate to. And I don't like referring to this example. But if you remember, the first president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, the second president, Thabo Mbeki, from the same group, ethnic group, same language. And there was a time where, Kathy, you are in the media industry a long time. People were not interested in who became president as long as they were not Xhosa. You know what I mean? And it was almost the same dynamic with TPLF. Like, we are so used to running the show because Meles Zenawi was a powerful president, a prime minister. He did a lot of good things for Ethiopia, but they almost became the ruling elite, TPLF, that they never could quite get used to the fact that they were no longer running the country, even though the prime minister had done so well to enforce the peace agreement with Eritrea, to reestablish diplomatic and trade links with Somalia, and in so doing, make that region the powerful region that it was going to become. Because by getting the coalition of Somalia and Eritrea and Ethiopia and Djibouti right, they were going to strengthen the East African community, Kathy, which is made of 6 countries already. And that East African and Horn of Africa region would be untouchable in terms of economic and regional integration.
Of course, this war, this conflict has had its own economic consequences for that region. You not only have a situation where there are individuals that are linked with the conflict that have been sanctioned. There's, of course, been a huge withdrawal of aid, in particular, of support, rather, I should say instead, particularly from those who have taken a strong view about this conflict, and it's harmed Ethiopia and the Tigray region.
Yeah, that was a bit mischievous, I can tell you for sure, because withdrawing humanitarian aid because of what you don't understand. I don't think the conflict in Ethiopia was understood by people who were commenting from a distance. I'm happy that part of the agreement, Kathy, is that humanitarian aid shall be restored, because women and children and the vulnerable members of society should never have to suffer. But let me tell you this, the economic upward trajectory of Ethiopia has been maintained. Number one, Ethiopian Airlines is still the most successful government-owned airline in Africa. Number two, Bole International Airport has replaced Dubai as the gateway to Africa in terms of air traffic. Number three, as you know, Safaricom, Vodacom consortium has managed to win the contract to privatize the mobile network operation. This is 100 million people. So yes, there are problems, but the overall economic upward trajectory of Ethiopia has not been dampened. And I'm glad that this little sideshow, it is not a sideshow if you consider that lives were lost. But if you look at the motive and what was behind it, you have to call it a sideshow. I'm glad that it has not derailed the overall trajectory of the upward trend that Ethiopia has been on over the past 25 years.
When we again look at the various global interests that are at play in Ethiopia, of course, depending on who you're speaking to, and it goes right back to the election, right, of which countries supported which individuals for the elections, and including what you've raised about the TPLF effectively being disgruntled about being voted out of power. Do you think that we're going to see a different approach to that conversation? Because when we look at this peace agreement, part of what they say they're going to do is also to stop the propaganda that has been published from both ends. And I think this is one of those aspects that has a lot to do with propaganda.
And you have to remember, when Abiy Ahmed took over, Kathy, he was the very friendly man towards the press. But he was preaching self-reliance of Ethiopians. He was talking mutual interdependence of Ethiopians. But he got to the point where I think he found himself having to counter some of what he considered propaganda. Again, to understand this, you don't only have to go back to the arrival of Abiy Ahmed on the scene. You don't have to go back to 1991 when the government of Mengistu was replaced. You have to go back to when the Italians failed to colonize Ethiopia. And they created that secession in the creation of Eritrea, that way blocking the access of Ethiopia to the sea and frustrating its economic growth. So it's not something that people like me who watch these things from a broad macroeconomic perspective are fazed by. Because you can read one or two newspaper articles, you can listen to two or three people who are called experts, but if you know the regional and geopolitical tensions that created Eritrea in the first place, you will understand that the bigger sovereign respect should go to Ethiopia, and it must be allowed to do what Abiy Ahmed had started in unifying the Horn of Africa. Because it's when that unification is respected and upheld that Africa, the intra-Africa coordination, trade and investment and collaboration can be attained.
Victor, let's wrap it up here in terms of what the future then holds post this agreement. How long do you think it's going to be before we actually see signs of progress? Because it's one thing, signing this agreement in Johannesburg tonight, but completely different when it comes to the implementation and having to go back home and explain to all of the various parties that have interest that this is now what we are going to do. And we've seen peace agreements of this nature on the continent crumble before.
That depends entirely on TPLF. Abiy Ahmed is nobody's fool, Kathy, I'll tell you that. He understands ethnic tensions. The man has a PhD in ethnic studies. So he understands, and he's a security man, so he understands this. But whether or not this peace can hold depends 100% on the TPLF. If they go back home and say, people, we are part of Ethiopia, we have been part of this coalition, let's respect the sovereign integrity of our country, it will hold. But what I'm glad about is part of the agreement is restoration of humanitarian aid. The other stuff will depend on TPLF and whether they can honor this agreement. Because I'm sure that Abiy Ahmed as Prime Minister has never been interested in fueling conflict, no matter what you've heard him being called. He was always trying to run Ethiopia, and that's how he ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize. But I'm sure it depends on TPLF. If they get mischievous again, it will not hold.
Victor Kgomoeswana, we'll leave it there for tonight. Thanks for your time.